Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Back today with Joshua Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. Good morning. Good late morning, Josh.
Good late morning to you.
After morning. Well, as the results from the national election have become a little more settled, I mean, as we record this on Thursday afternoon, I think there's still a handful of House races out at the national level, but the expectation is that the Republicans will take over the House. Democrats have already kind of locked down the Senate, even with the runoff coming. I thought what we could do today is kind of engage, at least as a point of departure, one of the he said that, yes, we are promising a digressive podcast in advance, if you didn't read that leading indicator. Both of us gotten calls and, there's stuff out there, reading like, looking at kind of a contrast between the national election results and the environment and Texas. Now, say from the very beginning, it's a little bit of a straw man.
It's a lot of,
But we are hearing this, right? Like, why is it looking like this nationally, but Texas seems so different?
Yeah, and just real quick, there's sort of like a meta answer, which is that, more than one thing can be true at the same time.
Yeah.
And in general, I think one of the difficult things, especially after an election, is, and this is not, I think all kinds of people do this for all kinds of different reasons, but there's a tendency to want to draw a straight line between one point and an outcome.
Yeah.
And say, well, this is what it was, or this wasn't it, or whatever. And the reality, of course, is like, life is complicated. A lot of factors can be going on at the same time. And then what that means is that sometimes you can make these observations that can be contradictory to each other, yet they can still both be true depending on what it is you're actually looking at here. And I think that's sort of, this kind of weird space, in sort of the kind of, national environment discussion, what happened there, and then squaring that away with Texas. On its surface, there's definitely some conflicts.
Yeah. And I think specifically what we're hearing is, the other piece of this is how much expectations of, varying, groundedness,
right.
actually helped, front load this. But the bottom line here, I think, is that, the big narrative nationally has been we are anticipating a red wave nationally. It didn't happen.
Right.
And yet in Texas, Republicans won everywhere. And I think that's the setup for,
right.
Republican hegemony held pretty. So let's unpack that a little bit. So, look, there are some contrasts here. And, by putting these out there, this is not an endorsement of these. It's kind of just the setup, right? But, so people looked at the close partisan division nationally, which in a sense meant no red wave in this, among other things, versus just the steady GOP dominance in Texas. Another aspect of this, is kind of the abortion seems to motivate and mobilize Democrats in the country or in parts of the country. We're already back, already qualifying, and seemingly did not to that extent in Texas. Now, that's a little bit of an open question. Another would be, the idea that people are looking at, pretty high turnout in many parts of the country versus, we were talking about this earlier, and we kind of dug this out last week. Not low turnout in Texas, but moderate turnout, comparatively moderate turnout in Texas.
Where Texas usually ends up.
And where Texas usually ends up relative to other states. So, I guess the burr under the saddle here is for today is, this seems a little bit myopic.
Yeah.
Right? And I think part of this is simply that in addition to your point about people want to sort of make things monocausal in the most kind of simple terms. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to get out of those narratives. And I think in terms of media discussions, it's an easy setup. It's a little bit of a straw man, kind of what we're doing to some degree, I guess.
But we're being honest about it.
But at least we're just using, we're being honest that we're using it as a setup. In some ways, the objects of comparison to my mind are just wrong, right? And that, people are going, hey, look, it's a closely divided chambers of Congress, and we've got these high turnout competitive states. How come Texas doesn't look like that? Or how come only some districts look like that? But all of that is very different than talking about Texas.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I think it's the two things, right? It's what you said and it's the other thing you said, and it's also this idea of sometimes stated often implicit expectations. And just as a side, part of it is if there was an expectation of a red wave that didn't materialize, that doesn't mean that there was a blue wave either, right? And that's the first thing is that, to the extent that I think if you were in Texas and you were sort of trying to deal with, on the one hand, especially if you were a Democrat in Texas, I would say in particular, trying to deal with, on the one hand, national coverage over the last few days that has left Democrats feeling pretty okay about themselves, but then looking at the same thing, yeah, but Beto lost by 11 points.
Yeah.
Part of it is saying, well, wait, how does this square? How did the same, we're common, we say this all the time, and I think it's valid here, and it still is valid here, Texas is part of the U.S.
Right.
Right. And so ultimately, but that would lead a smart listener to say, well, yeah, but if Texas is part of the U.S., why didn't we see in Texas what we saw elsewhere? And I would say we did see in Texas what we saw everywhere else, right? Which is we saw, and this is actually true if you look back at the 2020 election, people pointed out in 2020, Joe Biden wins the election, usually the president's party gets, big majorities, usually on the president's coattails, and people point out, well, that didn't really happen this election. Really, we kind of came out of it with a pretty similarly divided, Congress, a pretty closely divided political system. And ultimately 2022 looked a lot like that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately Democrats can be happy that they didn't get slaughtered everywhere. But really what we saw was, I would say instead of continuity, we were talking about this, like change versus continuity is the way we talk about it a lot. But I mean, really we saw less so than continuity, but a preference for the status quo versus the alternative. And what that means is that in states that tended to be Democratic states or states that were trending Democratic, if they were Democratic incumbents, they seemed to do okay. If there were Republican incumbents in states that are Republican or trending in the Republican direction, they seem to do pretty okay. And Texas is no different than that, right? I mean, it's in a lot of ways.
And yeah, I mean, there was kind of a steady state at work here. And, and I think the other thing we also have to remember is that there's kind of there's a problem of kind of totalizing the election returns at the national level, particularly in a midterm election. In fact, there are other states that looked a bit like Texas. They have different trajectories, but I mean, it was a very big Republican night across the board in Florida.
Right.
Very, very big Republican night across the board in Ohio. And those are not trivial examples. Those are actually pretty good comparative cases in their own ways. Now, I think both got more media attention because there has been change going on in those states. Both had been seen as swing states. Yeah. And as, there had been a lot of competition. I mean, I used to joke in giving talks when people would say, do you think the future of Texas is going to look like California because it's inevitably going to turn blue and the demographics and all that we beat to death in here? And I had a punchline that would say, look, I don't think that Texas is going to look like California. I think it's going to look more like Florida. Yeah. Now, I can't use that joke anymore now that Florida has turned, but it does sort of underline the point that, in both of these states, I mean, and I think we mentioned this last week, we saw Governor DeSantis, win Miami-Dade. Now, I think the interpretation of that is a whole other issue about gets us into Latinos and what's been going on in Florida. But nonetheless, there are big examples of, the fact that it's a closely divided country. And, a lot of what we saw was not earth-shakingly, new. Right? Yeah.
Well, and I mean, the other thing is, you can't, this is sort of an aside, but you can't really discount you can't really discount the effect that redistricting also played on this. I think there was an idea going into the redistricting process, both in Texas and elsewhere, that, this would lead to sort of wild, deviations, in terms of the outcomes, off of whatever we say, off of the margins of victories in the state as opposed to, tiny ones. And when people came back and started looking at this, they said, well, actually, this probably is going to, I think a lot of people say this actually probably helps Democrats a little bit more than I think people generally tended to anticipate the redistricting process. And that's the thing, is that what you ended up finding was in a lot of states, the ultimate consequence of redistricting was to solidify the position of incumbents in most places. And so it's not surprising to see an election which incumbents do incredibly well. I think I saw by last count, the re-election rate for incumbent representatives to Congress so far, with races still outstanding, so the denominator is still not, still bigger, right? It still isn't complete yet, was like 97.5%. It's like, which again is like, it's that high.
Right.
And so really, you can't have a ton of change, under that kind of set of conditions, right?
Right. And I think, again, that, Texas looks that way. It's very similar to other places where we see that dynamic. And it really does raise the point of, and we had talked about it in different ways going into the election. But as we digest what just happened, one of the things that has really occurred to me is that the approach the majority took to redistricting in Texas, in the legislature in particular this time, in terms of, the largely protecting incumbents of both parties. Mm-hmm. And, Democrats fared worse than Republicans, et cetera.
Yeah.
It not only stabilized the pattern in the way that you would expect to partisan advantage. We'd have to look at this, and this may or may not be empirically demonstrable, but I suspect that it also contributed to the lack of the perception of competitiveness that hurt the overall mobilization effort for Democrats.
I agree with that. And again, I mean, one, we have to look at the data to be more certain about a statement like that. But on the other side of it, I got a question from a reporter about turnout in Williamson County,
right,
as an interesting example. And I went, and they're saying, turnout in Williamson County was very high. It was above the statewide average. I think it was about 10 points higher than the average statewide, which is pretty big.
Yeah, I saw that.
And, she was sort of asking why, and I went back to look at it. And there's a couple things. One, Williamson County is a high turnout county. I mean, just setting aside, they're always above the statewide average, and it's actually been increasing.
Ethnic composition, level of education, competitiveness.
And that's exactly
right. Competitiveness asterisk.
And that's the thing that I was focusing on, was to say, look, what do we know about Williamson County? Well, one, we know that, up in Round Rock, they were having a big school board races, which were drawing a lot of people into that process. We also know they had one of the few open and competitive state house seats in 52, Tallarico's old seat that was redrawn.
They redrew as a Republican seat and was competitive, and Tallarico moved into another seat.
Right.
Yeah.
And then people are also pointing out, they're saying, oh, and look, Abbott won this county, just barely, that Biden and O'Rourke had won in the previous election. Now, one thing I like to point out is he barely won it. Biden barely won it. O'Rourke barely won it. Abbott won it by a bunch more, actually, than he did in 2018, and he won it by a lot more than that in 2014. But this is the point. This is a prototypical county where both parties are competing heavily for voters. Right. It's highly populated. Williamson County is one of the fastest growing counties in the country, right? And so what you're seeing is a place where there is competition.
Right.
There's competition in the state house. There's competition in the school boards. And you've got the two statewide candidates likely, I think when you go back and look, probably spending a good amount of money and mobilization efforts to get the large number of voters who live in these areas turned out.
In conjunction with that, to go to the point I was making, is kind of like, so what you're seeing as an example of there is sort of bottom up,
right?
Sort of impetus that's for turnout.
Yeah, and the thing is, what I was going to say is, and really, if you're going to say, well, how many other sort of counties in the state would really match, kind of the characteristics you're talking about, and say, I could probably count it on two hands or less.
Right.
Out of 254 counties.
Well, and as we said going in, since we were looking at, we were emphasizing the school board races, but also the legislative seats in that area, you got to really stretch to say that there were 10 competitive legislative races.
Yeah.
In both chambers.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, the point I was, sort of had been kind of kicking around was how much that took a lot of, so the Republican, the redistricting mass Republicans do help them in two different ways. Obviously, it helped them in the obvious ways that maps help you, but it also helped them in diffusing competition down ballot. Well, we'll have to look at that a little bit more, I think. And, look at some of the ballot roll-off, compare ballot roll-off in some of those races, something like that.
And I'm totally shooting from the hips here, so I may regret this. But I'll just say, I got some questions in the aftermath. I didn't end up answering for very I don't know why. I don't remember. I think it was too late in the day or something, and then I was after the deadline. But there were some questions floating around about what about the votes that may not get counted in Harris County? Would that make a big difference? Now, the first thing to say is no. Just hard stop, no. The gap is so big, it's not going to make a difference. But if you're thinking about, if I'm thinking about the overall impact of various factors in Texas's turnout this election and trying to allot amounts, I would, again, or even trying to rank order the importance of them in terms of, explanation, the institutional sort of midterm stuff, non-presidential election year, all that business is probably at the top. I would probably put, the lack of competition in, probably exacerbated by redistricting above voting rules. And that might be a little controversial.
Yeah.
But when I think about, again, the marginal impacts that voting rules really generally tend to have on people versus, amongst those people who are really in the mix as potential voters, whether or not there's something to vote for of consequence, that to me is going to be a much bigger impact.
No, I think that's, that's kind of where I'm headed. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's right. Or at least potentially right. We need to look at that a little more closely, I think.
Right.
And,
I agree.
there might be a little bit of an asterisk in those Harris County votes, depending on where those votes are and where, some of those local races.
Well, you mentioned something. So, I mean, the thing about the Harris County votes is, they're more likely to have an impact because they're more likely to be lopsidedly Democratic. But then you brought up something else too, which was you're talking about the role that abortion played in the election in some parts of the state, and the role that it seemingly did not play in Texas. And I mean, I think this is a little bit of a repetition, but I mean, I think that's an oversimplification in the sense that if your thought was abortion is going to mean Democrats are going to win in Texas, then yes, your expectation is missed. But the thing is this is just important to recognize and I think this is something that probably was sort of, it's like one of those things, like a lot of things, it becomes clearer, in hindsight, like everything.
Once thing actually happens,
But I mean, this is what we didn't see. We did not see large subsets of certain voters switching party allegiances.
Due to abortion. We did not see significant shifts in the composition of the electorate that would be, reflective of, let's say, voters voting at vastly different rates or significantly different rates from prior elections due to abortion. Yeah.
And I think the issue here is just, and it's real simple, which is, if you think about voters who are either very pro-life or very pro-choice, their vote was pretty much guaranteed. I mean, those voters have, if their main issue is abortion and either abortion access or prohibition, they have two parties and they know who to vote for, and they vote for those parties.
And if it's not your main issue, then it was probably overwhelmed by partisanship or other issues.
Right. And
partisanship in your voting habits.
And if it was your main issue and you weren't a partisan voter, let's say you're someone who's not really heavily, integrated, engaged in the system, but abortion brought you out, well, what I would say is that regardless of what the split is, it's not going to be 9-1 pro-choice Democrats, pro-choice now Democrats turning out. It's going to be something like, probably on this state, maybe 6-4, right? Which means that, and it's important to say like out of 10, right? Because part of it is like, so for maybe every 10 voters you add, maybe the Democrats gain 2. And really when you say, well, but wouldn't that be a lot? And it's like, but remember what we just said before, we're talking about a real marginal number of people we're probably adding to the electorate because of the abortion issue.
Right.
And so it's not that it fizzled, it's just that I think more than anything, it probably reinforced the partisan dynamics that we already see here. And and we did talk about this a little bit beforehand. People were kind of overestimating what the ceiling was on, how many people were going to vote based on the salience of this on both sides. Yeah. And I honestly think that the interpretation of the really mostly exit polling in other states and in other Democratic leaning states tends to overinterpret that data, not because we don't think that data is super reliable. That's a separate discussion, which we always kind of put a pin in. But because, if you think about it, what were Democrats talking about since the summer? They've been talking about abortion. And when you ask in a Democratic state where a majority of the voters are Democrat, what their main issue is going to be or is, it's not surprising to find that it's the issue that Democrats were talking the most about, were emphasizing the most. But that doesn't mean that abortion won Pennsylvania for Democrats, right? And that's the thing. Again, it gets very easy to sort of say, draw that straight line. And you want to say, well, there's a straight line between the abortion decision and Democratic turnout and Democratic success in Pennsylvania. And you could say, well, maybe, but also, I mean, the flip side is like, how much did this add to what we would expect as a baseline turnout level? And you'd say it's probably a little bit. It probably helped.
Yeah.
But then part of the problem becomes, it's not that it's a problem making that interpretation, but it's then when you start saying, well, why didn't this thing happen in Texas? Like, I'm not sure it happened in Pennsylvania. Like, let's just, and if it did, it was a marginal effect. And so, to the extent it did or did not happen in Texas, we're talking about a fraction of a marginal effect happening here that may or may not have happened somewhere else. And so I think that's where these things start to get pretty confused pretty quickly.
The entanglement of those agenda items and just the sheer force of partisanship right now, pretty hard to disentangle.
Yeah. I mean, almost, I would say almost impossible.
So I think that, as we look at these things and, what's similar, what's different, as we were saying at the beginning, it's really, I think, kind of more useful to think about, particularly as we move past the election, which hopefully we will be doing soon.
Please.
it's kind of more useful to think about how Texas fits into the overall constellation of national politics, which I think is reflected in all these things we're saying about what's constitutive, what the limits to the contrast and the limits to just how you conceptualize, thinking about Texas on one hand and the country on the other. I think as this all settles and as we just look at what's happened just in the week since the election, my expectation is that the state will continue to provide a kind of ballast for the National Republican Party as we turn immediately, not
Right.
surprisingly, but even more immediately than usual, I think, given the Trump announcement yesterday. For the National Republican Party, both in presidential politics and in Congress. What I mean by that is, Texas is still going to be a key piece of the electoral college strategy of whoever runs for president. It's still likely to be a pretty reliable piece, whatever we see, as we've talked about, in the decreasing margins in presidential races, and in Congress. I think that just leads us back to where we live most of the time, which is, within the Republican coalition, if you want to call it that, the fractious Republican coalition in the state, we're already seeing the internal factional battles playing out at the moment. And, this is obviously happening nationally. You can't pick up
Right, yeah.
You can't open your inbox if you get the political newsletters without talking about, the maneuvering in the U.S. House over McCarthy's leadership.
Right.
The brewing, I think challenge is too strong a word, but the complaining about Mitch McConnell, the fact that Senator Scott is going to challenge him. The two Texas senators are actually sort of maneuvering in that, and I think both are sort of supporting a delay in the vote for the next majority leader.
Although I wouldn't be surprised to see those two split.
Eventually, I think
far.
that's right. But both of those are interesting questions.
Yeah.
Well, in terms of the Corn and Cruz thing right now, we're seeing the same kind of combination of, factional, personal, ideological fights breaking out nationally, but particularly in the state right now, and that we're then waiting to see how they play out in the legislation in the legislative session.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. To put it that. You hadn't put it that way in front of me before we talked about this, and it is really remarkable to look at it and say, you're seeing the same dynamics play out among Republicans, both at the national level, where the sort of seeming impetus for that is, the underperformance.
Yeah.
Right. So on the one hand, you've got these questions about, Trump's role in the party, and, you've got Rick Scott, who everybody was, a lot of Republicans were very unhappy with during much of the campaign season. Now he's challenging McConnell. And it's interesting, again, in the wake of, it's not surprising in the wake of sort of underperformance, especially more so losses, but underperformance, to see sort of a certain amount of finger pointing going on. But yet in Texas, you're seeing almost the same thing, but there's not about the finger pointing, right? It's not about we underperformed or,
Right.
The same factional issues. And I wonder, I'm kind of almost asking this.
There was a tiny bit of underperformance carping by some of the usual suspects, but go ahead.
Well, yeah. No, exactly. But that's also clearly also functional towards the argument more generally about, changing in leadership and sort of agenda control at the state level. I guess what's interesting to me in all of this in some ways is the fact that I wonder how much of this is a reflection of kind of the ossification of the overall political system in some way. It's been, and again, it may be overdoing it because I think we see this in Texas every time. We're going to kind of get into this, but much of what we're seeing in the movement right now and the potential conflicts between especially Republicans within the caucus over where power is going to lay in the legislature, that happens every time. It's interesting to see it also taking place at the national level, but it also kind of raises to me this idea of, if politics are as ossified as they are, then really this is where the battle takes place.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think that's why, it's interesting, that's why I'm eager to pivot to the legislature, right? Because I think at least, from the perspective of what we're looking at in the next 6 months, if not a little bit longer than that, is, as you say, some of the litigation of the same issues, but then, the perpetual question of, and I think this came up a little bit last week, how do the players interpret the elections with the overlay of, how are some of the ongoing fights that we've now seen going on and contention and rivalries play out, in a slightly changed terrain, right? So, the leadership will be the same.
Right. Almost certainly, right? I mean, the Speaker of the House, is...
Yeah. I'm willing to say the leadership will be the same.
Just checking, making sure.
Yeah. And we can, we can come back to that. I do want to come back to that. I mean, I think that fits in this discussion, right?
Right.
And, so we'll, barring, something really, really, really surprising,
right.
Dade Phelan will be the Speaker again, despite this challenge from Tony Tinderholt, which I think we mentioned last week. It just happened. And, the discussion of the agenda is strikingly familiar, right? In terms of, Exhibit A this week, Governor Abbott didn't take him very long to double down again on Operation Lone Star and the border. He sent letters this week to county judges across the state and to DPS, the leaders of the DPS and the Texas National Guard, essentially reminding them that Operation Lone Star was going to continue and that it was more urgent in the wake of a federal judge this week blocking the implementation of Article 42 expulsions.
And memorializing the invasion rhetoric into
state,
state
well, what was
history
interesting is that, I think there was some confusion out there because I think, and I just sorted this out fairly recently. I mean, people were circulating the proclamation from July.
Right.
Right. Now, and the letters invoked that proclamation. So even though the headlines were Governor Abbott formally declares invasion, this is not the kind of invocation of constitutional authority that a lot on the far right have been asking him to make, even though he gets some of the credit for that.
Well, I was going to say, and I remember talking to someone about this in July, and part of this was to say, it's not what the people who want it to be sort of the idea of a real invasion, what that could potentially mean from a legal
and a challenge to national authority.
But it also is another reminder of Abbott's willingness to play ball with those people.
Well, I think willingness is even the strategy of making sure that nobody of any prominence is going to get to the right of him on this. I mean, and, the through line, is still pretty evident here from the polling we're always talking about here with immigration and border security. But also, we were talking about the salience of abortion in the exit polls. Immigration was pretty salient. Immigration and border security were still pretty salient to Republican voters in the exit polls with all the caveats on the exit polls. So, as we go into the session, this factional, the surface of this kind of factional contention, is evident in the, familiar leadership dynamics. I mean, you raise the question of whether I'm, anointing Dade Phelan in a way too soon. And, I'm perfectly willing to say, yes, Dade Phelan has not formally been elected speaker yet. But, the challenge from the right, and several people have written about this, including credit where credit is due, Scott Braddock and Quorum Report. I mean, if you look back at what the challenges to the speaker were, I've complained year after year about people always making too much of them. Mm-hmm. Most of them have not made it to the floor.
Yeah.
To my mind, I think you have to read this not as a realistic intent on Tony Tinderholt's part or the part of any of his ideological fellow travelers that Tony Tinderholt will ever be speaker. It's more about raising the issue of ideological conservative orientation and, one or two particular issues. In this case, the issue of are there going to be Democratic chairs named by the speaker? It's kind of, I think Dade Phelan has already committed to this. We talked about this last week. I mean, the number of Democrats that you have chairing committees is a highly fungible thing that enables the speaker to, maintain, a Democratic backstop against factionalism in his caucus, but while, deciding where he is going to put Democratic chairs and for what reason and how many.
Yeah.
And, that's pretty, to my mind, that's just pretty straightforward. I think it's the raising of the issue and the heat check that it invites among the right, and whether, Tinderholt will make the mistake that Scott Turner did, a few sessions back, force this to the floor and put people on the spot who are then, blackballed is maybe a little bit of a strong term, but are at a disadvantage when it comes to committee assignments and advancing bills once the session actually starts.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was thinking. You're sort of on a fine line there between sort of extracting some concessions from what was always going to be the leadership versus putting yourself and your allies on the outs for an entire session.
Yeah, and
most people don't choose the latter.
Right.
I mean,
and so then similarly, then you look at the Senate. You've got Dan Patrick elected by a much larger, much wider margin than he was last time. Very secure in the Senate. No surprises. I mean, they would have liked to have, flipped the Lucio seat to a literal Republican, shall we say. And they did not just, they've not succeeded in doing that. There's probably going to be a recount in that race, but I don't think that's probably not going to change it, as we were saying last week. And so you've got Patrick there, in this kind of situation with Phelan, with the governor in this position, transmitting, trying to transmit an agenda that, again, very familiar. Mm-hmm. Setting the stage, though, for, what is still, I think, a very undetermined sense of where the pride of place is going to be on the agenda in this session. There's a lot of talk right now of issues that are, broadly speaking, kind of developmental Republican issues. Top of the heap, property taxes, education, Chapter 313 incentives. Bubbling under here is also some discussion of infrastructure and, this perpetual problem of managing to the state's rapid growth. On the other side, to slightly oversimplify, you've got abortion, guns, LGBTQ issues. How much continuity will there be from the agenda that was so successful in the very fractious, on partisan terms, 2021 session? And I think all of that, again, looks like a Texas variation on a national theme.
Yeah, and then the truth is, I mean, the more you talk about the less I care about the national theme, and the more I'm thinking more about these internal dynamics. And it does make you wonder, if you think about watching this session multiple times, what we're starting with was, there's always a speaker challenger somewhere. Right. Whether formal or informal, somebody always crops up. And I understand, it's just one of those things. There's so much drama to speculate on, and usually almost none of it actually happens. Well,
and again, we've talked about this, and I can't remember if I talked about this last week or not. I know I've done this in class before, but, I think the underappreciated piece of this is the change in the law a few years back that made it so that if you're going to be a speaker candidate, you have to register with the Secretary of State.
Right.
To my mind, that's on one hand, meant as a good transparency measure. It's got that. On the other hand, it's an invitation to display behavior.
Yeah.
Whether you think you're going to win or not. And, that's at work there, I think. And,
so, that's interesting, right? I think more broadly, you kind of, if you think about the last session, one of the things, we're coming off the presidential election cycle. I'm curious to see whether Abbott's hand is strengthened, kind of coming after a cycle in which he just won by 11 points and spent a ton of money, and how people interpret that in the process. He's kind of had, I would say, mixed success in his ability to move his agenda through the legislature. Same thing for Patrick. Patrick's agenda, I think, is getting, over time is getting more and more focused. If not focused on a clear kind of unifying set, but in the sense that as he achieves more of the things that he's wanted to set out to achieve, I think the list is getting a little bit more targeted, and the amount of effort he's putting into the things he cares about, I think, is going to be higher. At the House, it is him. I don't disagree that there's no reason to think until it's about to happen that Phelan is not going to be speaker, right? It'd be that kind of thing. But I'm curious to see what does he look like in his second session? There's certainly some management problems in the House last session that were problematic and, gave the Democrats a lot of openings to scuttle the process. Do they clean that up? What does that look like? And all those things are kind of intermixing in a way that's, it's pretty interesting. But again, to your point, still within an overall environment that looks
fairly familiar.
Familiar.
Well, and I think the other thing you want to add into that is, with the position of the speaker, that was a first term, and a first term that, arose out of a lot of chaos with the collapse of the Bonin speakership. Right. And, this is not a speakership that had been strategized for a long time.
Right.
Right. And that affected that. And I think, the ill will between the speaker and the lieutenant governor right now, which is accentuating, the traditional rivalry tension that exists at times between the House and the Senate. The operative question, the main question here is like, how operative is a situation that has seemed to be, I think, without too much debate, that the speaker and the governor are closer than either of them is to the lieutenant governor, right? And the lieutenant governor is able to leverage, his control of the Senate. It doesn't seem that Patrick's control of the Senate is going to decrease. There could be a little bit of a lame duck factor theoretically in the abstract, but I don't see it, right?
Not this session, I don't think.
On the side of the House and the governor, Phelan is in a stronger position in the House, at least structurally. And again, there's the management strategy, the execution. We'll see how they execute in terms of leadership. But the other piece of that is that Phelan was very involved in the elections, and they put a lot of money into the elections and a lot of resources, and exercised a leadership role in there that was a little bit similar to the leadership role that the governor's campaign played, to my mind, in 2020.
Yeah,
when there was a vacuum,
right?
Really, in the House because of the unpleasantness. I think that winds up helping Phelan. Whether they're able, his team and his leadership team is able to manage that is another question. There will be a lot of new faces. A lot of those new faces, though, will have some allegiance to the current speaker based on campaign relationships. And so I think, watching, the gravity of all of those actors has shifted subtly in different ways. But, we're not going to see what that looks like probably until things really get going. The bill filing, the early bill filing was not too telling. That all looked pretty familiar too in terms, and is usually not a particularly good leading indicator anyway. But it does give you a sense of what, certain people are interested in. And, and look, it's not a surprise, but it is, we were talking about having evidence earlier. Yeah. If you look at the kind of bills that people like Representative Slayton filed,
that's what I was thinking.
Things like this,
what is
the
that
emphasis on, further action on the LGBTQ front, more ratcheting down of the electoral system, in those kinds of, in addition to people's traditional, business as usual bills, there's a little bit to be seen there. I don't think it's, so I think the other thing, the next big thing we're really kind of waiting for, that we're going to have to wait for for a while, and will fuel a lot of the internal speculation, is what the committee chair assignments look like in both chambers, but particularly since Phelan is a bigger question mark, particularly in the House.
Yeah, and the thing that I was thinking you were going to say is probably secondary would be like, so what are you going to do with that budget surplus?
Yeah, well, I think that
it's a big,
and that's, that's going to be the substance, right? That's not a leading indicator. That's going to be the thing, right? Or one of the things. So with that, thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to our excellent production team in the Dev Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Remember, you can find some of the data we referenced today, but lots of other data at the Texas Politics Project website. That's texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thank you for listening. We'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.